BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
I had parts of my hair torn out. She came up from behind and smashed my head on the floor. I ended up with a black eye. She ran at me from behind and I tried to break my fall. I hit a hanging glass planter which smashed. So that ended up in an A&E visit that evening and plastic surgery.
This is Maria. She's describing an extreme experience of violence at home. But it's not what you might be thinking. She's not talking about an intruder or her partner assaulting her. The person attacking her is her younger daughter, 11 years old.
I was in a perpetual state of anxiety and fear. I remember going to sleep at night and thinking, I don't want to wake up. I don't know what's going to happen. So I really understand domestic violence, that fear, because I didn't know, because of the way the children were, what explosion would happen next and why. It was just unpredictable. That was the scariest part.
We've changed Maria's name and some of the details about her children to protect their identities. She's voiced by an actor. What Maria is describing is very different from an occasional adolescent outburst of frustration and aggression. It can begin way before adolescence kicks in, as young as 3 or 4, and escalate over many years into violence that's impossible for parents to manage.
This is parents who are afraid of their children, who are changing their behaviour and the way they're living because of what's going on. This is a pattern of behaviour. It's not just a stroppy teenager. This is someone who's taken power in the house, is taking control of how things are happening.
It can be destroying property, it can be arguments, it can be feeling that your child is out of control. It can kind of range a whole raft of behaviours.
For most people, it's a very weird thing and you struggle to get your head around it. Often I will start talking about it and people will stop and say, you mean parents abusing their children? Because it's so out of our way of thinking.
In this programme, I'll be looking into this difficult and distressing subject, when children attack their parents both physically and verbally on a regular basis. Last year, the charity Family Lives reported that its helpline had seen an escalation in calls from family members concerned about violence from children and young people. 5% of callers contacted them about this issue between January 2020 and May 2022. Almost 40% of calls related to children 10 years old or younger. But it's hard to know how many parents like Maria face violence and abuse from their children, partly because parents are often afraid of the consequences if they seek help, of being blamed, judged, of their children being taken into care, or of criminalising their children if they call the police. So parents may only seek help when the situation has reached crisis.
I first became aware of the problem probably over 20 years ago.
Amanda Holt is a criminologist at Roehampton University and among the first to research the issue.
I was engaged in a project funded by the Home Office, and it was just a little evaluation project looking at the families of young people who are involved in the youth justice system. And when I went round to their houses to talk to them about the offending that their child was engaging in, I was really struck by the kind of offending that they were talking about, because they were talking about things that to me sounded like offending, but it was going on inside the family home. So they would talk about, broken windows or holes in walls. Some of the mums talked to me about being thrown across the room by their sons. And it wasn't just one or two parents, it was quite a few, to the point where I went online and thought, OK, I need to find out about what this is, because it was something that I hadn't even thought about before as being an issue. And I remember sitting in front of the search engine and not even knowing what words to type into the search engine to find out about it, because it didn't seem to have a name. But then when I did start looking and typing in phrases like violence towards parents, parent abuse, that kind of thing, there was just hardly anything out there.
Amanda Holt helped to write Home Office guidance on the issue in 2015. But giving this pattern of behaviour an agreed name is only now on the government's agenda. The Home Office published a consultation at the end of last year to find a common definition, and coming up with a definition matters, because without one, it's very hard to identify, measure, and develop effective policy. It's mostly known as child and adolescent to parent violence and abuse. Mothers are more often the victims than fathers. Sons are more often the aggressors than daughters. And it's a significant cause of breakdown in adoptions. Not surprisingly, research shows that there was an increase in cases during the pandemic lockdown.
Because we're now understanding that this is something that has many drivers, if you like, then we would say with confidence that any family of any background, any class, ethnic group, whatever, this is something that could happen to them.
Helen Bonnick is a former social worker who's a specialist on the issue and runs a website, Holes in the Wall, that's a resource for practitioners and parents. She first came across child-to-parent violence 40 years ago.
It's not to do with fault in that family. It might be to do with circumstances, health, the support they have around them. In some families, maybe only one child might be affected. And so we have to be able to explain that as well.
I think for so long, parents felt that there was a lot of blame attached to it. And is it a parenting issue? Have I done something wrong with my parenting? What did I do wrong in order for my child to think it's okay to use aggression or harmful behaviours towards me? And I think there's such a lot of shame and stigma attached to that.
Jane Griffiths founded Capa First Response 5 years ago to address a gap in services. She works with families and also trains social workers and police.
The families didn't really know where to go to, and if they did sort of find a professional who would listen to them, I think the interventions that were available weren't appropriate. Lots of parenting courses, which just reinforce parenting's feelings around feeling it's a parenting issue and feeling blamed for what was happening.
So if it's not a parenting issue, how would you describe it?
I always describe it as it's a relationship fracture and a communication breakdown. I'm not suggesting for a minute that for some families, how we parent our children can impact the outcomes of those relationships for families. However, there's generally 99% of the time a bigger issue going on for families. And understanding the bigger issue behind the behaviour is really, really important.
The lack of an agreed definition has made it hard to assess the scale of this behaviour and come up with a coordinated response. That's compounded by a lack of available data. Child-to-parent violence is not routinely flagged as a distinct category in police figures across the UK. In 2022, the London Violence Reduction Unit published a report revealing that most incidents between 2011 and 2020 in England and Wales took place in more deprived neighbourhoods. More than 40% were not reported to the police, so it's a hidden problem. The effect on family lives can be devastating.
It was really hard to be compassionate with her sometimes. It was fine for an hour of the day, but trying to do it for 8-9 hours of the day when she was constantly angry, she was really hard to be around.
Asma's daughter Mariam developed an eating disorder at the age of 12. Her behaviour changed and she became aggressive and abusive at home. At first, a couple of days a week, and later on a daily basis. The family has 3 children. We've changed Asma and Mariam's names to protect their identities. Asma is voiced by an actor.
I think initially when it started, it was kind of verbal abuse. She'd get angry. And then it just kind of went on. The boundaries she was crossing all the time with the language she was using. At worst, she could get violent. She was manageable because she doesn't have a huge amount of strength, but it did become a safeguarding issue on many occasions. I think she broke 2 of our TVs in anger.
Would she be violent towards you or anyone in the family?
She would. She'd kind of hit or smack you. I think the worst thing was, even if she'd done it, she was very unapologetic about it, but never to a point where she did us a great deal of harm, thankfully.
Were you more of a target than your husband, or was it equal?
It depended. It's just like parenting, good cop, bad cop. So whoever was challenging the disorder the most on that day was bad cop. If you left her to her own devices, which at times could be quite dangerous to her, then you were good cop.
What kind of effect did that have on you and the family?
It was a living nightmare because it was the irrational behaviour, the unpredictability. You didn't know what 1 hour to the next could look like. So you didn't know what you were waking up to. I always said it was a heightened version of parenting a teenager. Teenagers are tough, but this was a whole other level.
Jane Griffiths' organisation Capa First Response received on average 65 inquiries a month in June to December last year. That's almost double the number for the previous year. There's a 12-week waiting list.
I think what happens for many parents is when the behaviour starts, you kind of think, OK, something's going on here with my child, but maybe this is kind of normal, maybe this is what happens. But then the longer that goes on, the harder it is to talk about it outside of the home, because there's a realisation that actually that relationship has changed, and there's a fear of what may happen to them as a parent. And for some young people, they will say to their parents, if you tell anybody, I will actually tell them it's you hitting me, or I will tell them it's you causing this behaviour. So we kind of get parents and families when things have been going on for a long period of time. And what we're trying to do at Capa is get people earlier.
Getting help fast and knowing where to turn is part of the problem. The quality of state support can be very much a postcode lottery, and the wrong kind of intervention can be destructive to family life. Maria lived with violence daily from both her children for more than 5 years. This started when her elder daughter Sally began attacking her younger sister, who has special needs, including severe communication difficulties, when they were both under 10. It was an extreme case of sibling rivalry. Maria would often be caught in the middle and become a target. Her husband would also come under attack. But Maria got the brunt of it as she was at home during the day. Her elder daughter Sally was self-harming as well as aggressive, and Maria had to lock the kitchen knives in a safe. Maria and her husband sent their younger daughter Beth to a special needs residential school during the week to protect her and diffuse the situation. She already had a social worker, and there was no concern there about Maria and her husband's parenting, but it was a very different experience when it came to her elder daughter Sally.
Social services came in, wrote a report, and there seemed to be this confirmation bias. Like someone had written, this child is violent, and an assumption was made. That's what it felt like. And any interaction with social services, I felt very judged. I didn't feel helped. I didn't feel that anyone was saying, wow, that's a lot to deal with.
Did they propose anything to support you?
No. They just came round for a visit, talked to my daughter and would leave. It felt like they were filling their quota. That's what it felt like. And I've since learned the amount of cases social workers have is so astronomical that no wonder they tick boxes. They prioritise, but at the same time, I thought that they're actually not helping. They're blaming. The moment that involvement had an impact on our family, it was a really negative one. It turned our family against one another. That's what it felt like. Our daughter against me against my daughter, husband against wife. It felt like we were under attack.
Things reached a particular crisis when Maria's daughter Sally, then a teenager, smashed the windows at home and tried to kill herself. She was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. When her behaviour deteriorated again, once she was back at home, social services proposed that she be taken into care.
The decision was that we couldn't parent this child. We weren't effectively parenting her, and so she should go into care, which, reading between the lines, is you're making your child behave this way, so we're taking her into care. And I remember saying to the social worker at the time, this is so difficult. Living with her behaviour is so difficult, but I love my daughter, and as hard as that is, I don't want her to go into care because I know the stats on care. And she said, well, if you're not going to agree, we're going to take you to court. So my husband and I had a chat, and we can't put her through that. She's confused enough. She's in a really bad state, and we can't make her go to court. That would be catastrophic. So we came to the agreement that she would go under a voluntary section, and they said to us, she can come back whenever you like, just give a week's notice and that's fine. So we said, okay.
So you felt you had no choice because of what they would put her through if you challenged it?
Yeah.
That must have been incredibly hard.
Yes, it was. It was terrible.
Maria did not see her daughter for 6 months. During this time, Sally went off the rails. On one occasion, she was sectioned. She would regularly go missing from the care home and end up in hospital after drinking and taking drugs. Social workers then proposed that she be placed in a secure unit. Although Sally was in care, Maria and her husband still had parental responsibility for her.
Basically, they said, you can't parent her, so we're going to send her to a secure unit. I said to them, look, our daughter doesn't want to be in care. She wants to return home. She's escaping from care to do these things. It only happened on one occasion when she returned home that she ended up getting out of her mind on something. But that was the neat decision they made. They just drew a line between us and her being out of control.
What happened next?
They said, we're taking you to court and we're going to get her into a secure unit. And I said, over my dead body. We'll see you in court because you're signing her death warrant if you do that. I know my child and she will self-harm and probably suicide if you do that.
As a result of the court case, Maria's daughter Sally was returned to the family home. It was a vindication for Maria and her husband after being judged as failing parents. Thanks to the court, their daughter also received a diagnosis of autism. Family life is much calmer now. The violence has stopped and the children are getting on better.
She was misdiagnosed so often, and the extreme behaviour was put down to parenting, when actually what it was a child desperately asking for help because she found the world too difficult to navigate. And having a sister like hers is difficult for any child. It's difficult for the parents. So with a child who had undiagnosed autism spectrum disorder, it must have been really torturous.
In the Family Lives Helpline survey, 16% of calls relating to physical aggression concern children who are neurodivergent. Amanda Holt, Roehampton University.
If we look at some of the pathways to child-to-parent violence, I mean, I would never want to be as crude as to suggest there's a kind of simple cause and effect here, but certainly common pathways. The common denominator across them is most often trauma, whether that pathway is growing up in a violent household between parents, whether it is victimisation, early experiences of child victimisation, even cases of neurodiversity. We know that children who are autistic or ADHD or have other neurodivergent conditions, they experience huge amounts of trauma because their difference is often kind of pilloried by those in societies. They don't get the support that they need. They often face very disableist attitudes and discrimination, and that is very traumatising. And it's possible that the enacting of distress is what's being manifested as violence towards parents and carers.
There are many different factors that can lie behind this behaviour and multiple questions that need to be asked to identify them. Helen Bonnick.
We would say you need to look at what's gone on for that family. What happened for that woman while she was pregnant? What happened to her after the child was born? What were the health issues? What were the support issues? Were they a family living in poverty under severe stress? Was there a diagnosis of something? Any of these things of themselves won't necessarily mean that a child is using aggressive behaviour in the home. But if you have several of these piled on together and maybe poor support, whether that's in school or from family or from the community, then that can leave families very vulnerable.
Maria had to go to court to get a diagnosis that helped to explain her child's behaviour and rectify the local authorities' damaging assessment of the family's parenting. But it's not unusual for parents in similar situations to be accused of failing.
I think that's a really common approach or a common understanding that when a child is seemingly out of control, it's the parent's responsibility to manage the child, to sort of ensure they behave appropriately. However, for some, that's not possible.
Cathy Long is an independent social worker and the expert on children with disabilities and learning difficulties at the British Association of Social Workers.
If we think about social services, and I'm not advocating this completely, but I think there are elements of early help and early intervention which social services can provide, which aims to improve outcomes for children or prevent an escalating need or risk. It's not an individual service. It's more of a system of support delivered by local authorities and their partners working together and taking collective responsibility to provide the right provision. Sadly, parents are offered early help, but it's not with all services working together.
So why do you think that this kind of multi-agency approach isn't already in practice?
I think what happens is that the sort of limited resources within depleted resources within organisations mean that people aren't inclined to work together. And I know when I worked in the mental health service, it would be, well, that's not us, that's over to social services. And it's that kind of attitude which doesn't really help, because my view is we need to get the job done. We just need to do the right thing and to make this work, and different people to take different parts of responsibility.
When Asma's daughter Marianne became aggressive after developing an eating disorder, the family was put on more than one waiting list. So after 2 months of frustration, they found a private therapist. They were also referred to Talk, Listen, Change, a relationships charity based in Manchester that works with families experiencing domestic abuse. They finally started a programme of support with the charity 6 months after they first reached out for help. A practitioner met with the family weekly. Asma and her husband also attended sessions with parents, and their other children went to group sessions too. It was a positive experience for the family.
I was fed up with the support that was out there, quite negative about it. And it actually reassured me that organisations like Talk, Listen, Change do exist. I think it took a holistic approach with the family. At the time, you can see it's your child that's struggling. It's not the family that's struggling. So it's like, I need support for her, and where she needs the support, she's not getting it. And then it's like, what can be done with the rest of us? And actually, it taught us how to communicate better, to then better support her, I think. It still wasn't easy to support her, but it just helped. At the time, it felt that Mariam was separated from the whole family, and Talk, Listen, Change became that middle person to help with that communication, just until you were able to communicate directly again. But it's hard to communicate with a child that's really struggling, because they only hear what they want to hear.
Talk, Listen, Change has been running the programme for 3 years. The number of referrals in Greater Manchester has risen from around 40 a year to 200 in that period. Bonnie Webster is a domestic abuse practitioner for children and young people at the charity. She worked with the family for around 3 months. Mariam is now in recovery, and it's a much happier household.
I think a main thing was, with our kind of family approach you get, is I get kind of everyone's side of the story, which I think is really, really important for me to understand where might there be a lack of communication or conflict arising. The important thing I saw was this young person, I think, developed the tools to be able to communicate what she needed without being as aggressive or angry, and also letting the parents be able to actually listen to what their young person is saying and what they need, so then they can support her better, which I think there wasn't that at the start because of all the kind of conflict clouding what was going on. And then having family sessions where we could all sit down together in a calm space where an argument's not going to arise, let's listen to everyone's side of the story, was really, really important. And that was when I saw, I think, most of the change started to happen, when they realised that, oh, actually we do all want the same thing and we do all love each other and want that change.
the non-help or the wrong responses went on for years.
Amanda Borman ended up dropping out of the system when she failed to get the support she needed for her adopted daughter Jazz, who became aggressive early in the relationship at the age of 5. She had been removed from her birth family 10 times. She was excluded from school 5 times between the ages of 5 and 8.
I can't underestimate the difficulty of trying to get help then. People didn't understand it, that the inference was that I must be doing something wrong. And eventually I just thought, I've had enough of it. It felt like we were square pegs trying to fit into a round hole. And I just had to think, I'm a creative person. What can we create that fits us? And one of the things I'd observed with her is that every time we went into the wilds, everything calmed. My gut feeling was we really need to just focus on trust and attachment. And school is just interrupting that, and exclusion and isolation and rejection was compounding the trauma. So I had to make a decision to change my whole life, really. And that was to move. I sold my house, took a long-term tenancy on a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere.
Amanda later set up a charity, the Open Nest, to address the gap in support for adopted children and their families. It offers respite for families going through similar experiences as her and Jazz.
What we wanted to do is address systemic trauma and not have these systems or brick walls or assessments or financial issues to get in the way of people actually being heard. People can ring and just come. So when people come and have a retreat with us, say for 2 days, with their children who might normally find it very difficult to play together, or they might be quite aggressive verbally to their parents or whatever, they always say, I don't know how you do it. What is it you do? Or other professionals say, can you quantify it? It's just being there, not judging, allowing the space for people to talk and tell their story. Breaking cycles of trauma, so family work I do think is important. But I think what we do is we give carers and parents a break, and children are very wise. They know when somebody gets it.
In 2022, the government included child-to-parent violence in the statutory guidance to the Domestic Abuse Act. However, this only covers children over the age of 16. Many researchers and practitioners are also very uneasy about including children in that framework. Amanda Holt again, from Roehampton University.
When we think about domestic abuse, the way that domestic abuse is configured is around taking the perpetrator and holding them to account and ensuring that they feel the full force of the law. And we have a very criminal justice response to domestic abuse. But that was developed and configured on the idea that domestic abuse is something that's perpetrated by adults against adults. But because we're talking about under 18s, we don't deal with them in an adult criminal justice framework. We have a youth justice system because we recognise that they're children, we recognise that they're in a stage of fast development, and they're in all likelihood going to grow out of crime, which is why we don't ensure that they feel the full force of the law in the way that we do adults, because we recognise the stage of their development that they're at. So given that, it doesn't make sense really to then impose a domestic abuse framework that's designed for adults onto children. I think there are better and more appropriate ways of dealing with it and of organisations that should take the lead with it. And to me, it makes sense that children's social care, which is focusing on, the welfare of the child, would be the most appropriate service to take the lead in dealing with child-to-parent violence.
No statutory service has single responsibility for child-to-parent violence. We asked the Minister for Victims and Safeguarding, Laura Farris MP, for an interview, which was declined. A Home Office spokesperson said in a written statement,
"Child-to-parent abuse is often hidden from sight and can be harrowing for families affected. Since 2020, we have funded interventions for young people and families experiencing this issue. There is no agreed definition for this type of harm, making it difficult to identify and talk about. We recently launched a consultation on the definition of child-to-parent abuse, and we will carefully consider the outcome of that to ensure that a range of views, including those of people who have experienced it, are taken into account.
In Northern Ireland, the Department of Justice is awaiting the finalisation and publication of a new domestic and sexual abuse strategy that will provide a framework for addressing child-to-parent violence. In Scotland, the Justice Directorate told us that they're working with key partners to inform future policy and best practice in this area.
Good morning, everybody. I recognise so many faces, and in effect you provided support.
Roger Thompson is Education Lead at the Violence Reduction Partnership in Merseyside. It commissioned a report last year on child-to-parent violence after local partners raised the issue, and they met in January to consider their next steps with representatives from youth justice, domestic abuse charities and other organisations. There are 20 units like Merseyside's in England and Wales. They're funded by the Home Office and bring together the police, health, education, local government and community groups to tackle serious violence. The report highlighted child-to-parent violence as a considerable issue across Merseyside. Its recommendations include a need for more training and for more effective gathering of data. I met Roger Thompson and Rebecca Bates, one of the authors of the report, at the Public Health Institute, Liverpool John Moores University.
What we're aiming to do is shine a light so that people can have the confidence to discuss it. I'd say that it's not an issue that's pertinent just to Merseyside, it's a national issue, but we are wanting to make sure that we create a Merseyside response.
The aim of today is to set up a multi-agency steering group across different services with the hope of improving support for families and to ensure that there isn't duplications or that families are able to access not just one service but multiple services. Potentially one family might not be applicable to one service and then that service can then signpost them to another. So it's really about that interconnection between the different services and helping them to work better together.
It's a strategy that's going to need funding. Emily Sporrell is Merseyside's Police and Crime Commissioner.
I think in Merseyside we have seen huge cuts to policing. Our local authorities have had some of the biggest cuts in the country over the last 10, 13 years. We're doing some really good work with our Violence Reduction Partnership, thanks to that funding that we've had, and they're really highlighting some of these issues. But a big part of the discussion today is how do we sustain that? How do we put in those long-term approaches? But if we don't get that funding that we desperately need from government, and this is familiar in lots of areas of work, but this is such a key area, we need that sustainable funding. So actually local authorities, policing, all those different third sectors, they have the funding and the resources they need to respond because there's no quick wins to this. It takes intensive involvement in these families and you can't do that cheaply.
As the accounts in this programme reveal, parents are often left waiting for help or receive inadequate and sometimes harmful interventions. For parents like Maria, continuity of care from social services and better communication between agencies would have made a big difference.
It was like notes handed over from one person to the other person who never bothered to sit around the table with the family. You should be treating the family, not just the child. You should be getting to know the child through the family and vice versa, and a more holistic approach. How many experts had seen one of the children and failed to diagnose them? How many experts didn't talk to one another? How many social workers didn't talk to one another? It was a mess.
Children who commit violence at home are slipping through the net, even though the statutory guidance on multi-agency child protection recognises that children who pose a risk of harm need safeguarding as well as children who are victims of abuse. Amanda Holt.
According to the criteria of children's social care services, if there's no child in the house, under the age of 18 that's at risk of harm, then there's nothing they can do. And they're already, of course, completely overwhelmed by cases where children are at huge risk of harm in the family home. And that's where, of course, they need to prioritise their resources because they have such few resources at the moment.
But surely a child who is committing an act of violence is a child at harm?
Yes, I completely 100% agree with that. And I suppose what I would like to see happen is the definition of when children's social care services intervene. I don't know if I want to say broaden, but certainly that recognises the harms caused to children who are engaging in violence towards their parents and carers. Because it's not true that they just walk away unscathed after an incident of violence. They are absolutely at risk in a kind of broader sense than how children's social services might frame what we mean by risk of harm.
The Home Office told me that the findings of the consultation will be used to develop new guidance on child-to-parent violence and that they intend to work closely with frontline professionals. However, it will not be statutory, which means that agencies will not be required to follow it by law. Part of the solution may also be for child-to-parent violence to have more public visibility, so that it's more widely recognised and talked about. It might help to reduce the stigma and the isolation for families, as well as making it a priority for policy.
When I think of this issue, when I think of what's happening within families, it reminds me of where we were with domestic abuse and violence back in the 80s. We know it was happening. It was very much behind closed doors. We didn't really have that huge understandings. We didn't really know how to appropriately support families. And it was very one-dimensional support. And I think that that's probably where we are with this behaviour. And I think as professionals, how do we best help parents? How do we make families feel comfortable to talk to us? So we're kind of on the cusp of change, but we're still very much where we were.
This File on 4 podcast was presented and produced by Jo Glanville. The technical producer was John Calver and the editor was Bridget Harney. It was a Loftus Media production for BBC Sounds, where you can find more radio, music and podcasts.
Hello, I'm David Yelland.
And I'm Simon Lewis. We're the hosts of Radio 4's When It Hits the Fan, the podcast which looks at how big names and big companies manage their PR.
But what about your own personal PR? How do you better manage your own reputation at work? We're here to help. With a series of special bonus episodes, we'll bring a little wisdom and share some tips to hopefully make you better at that job.
Quick Wins is a series of short and snappy episodes with lots of advice aimed at improving your working life. If that sounds useful, then please listen and subscribe on BBC Sounds. Just search for When It Hits the Fan.